All right, next week. Oh, next week we don't have Guthrie Street aging. Next week is a complete mystery as of now. So don't forget to sign up for the mystery presentation. It will be fantastic. So much for my script. And just like this week, you know, you plan on one thing, you get something better. So anyway, this week we have, at very short notice and very kindly, David Ellison has offered to give his talk on the Mexican Revolution, the most consequential event in Mexico, bar none. Now, David is a retired teacher of 36 years. He's taught everything from 4th grade to college, and his main subject was history. He's been here 4 years in Ajijic, originally from Berkeley, California. Please give a nice, warm, open circle welcome to David Ellison.
Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me?
No, take off the mask.
I'll take my mask off. That's true. There we go. Hopefully I don't frighten you now. Okay, I just want to see how long I'm babbling for. Yes, I taught for 36 years. History was my favorite subject, but I don't claim to be an expert on Mexican history. If I have time, and I'll tell you why, but I'm writing a book about Mexican history. It's called Niños Héroes, the fascinating stories about Mexican street names. And so I've taught myself Mexican history, and so today I'm going to share what I've learned. Today's topic is the Mexican Revolution, which they celebrate tomorrow, not to be confused with the Mexican War for Independence. And they have three main holidays. First is September 16th, which is Independence Day. And then tomorrow, the 20th, is Revolution Day. And then February 5th is Constitution Day. And Revolution and Constitution are intrinsically linked together. And as I told Phil to say, the Mexican Revolution was bar none the most consequential event in Mexican history. And that will become really clear as we continue. Just a little bit of background about Mexican history prior to this. For most of Mexican history, most of the wealth and power was concentrated into a rather small oligarchy of hacienda owners, the church, and the military. And they ruled, and they were the conservatives. Now, opposing them were the liberals, who wanted to open up everything and distribute the land and the wealth. And they had been at war with each other forever. In fact, during Mexico's first 30 years, they had 50 different governments. Only one president actually got to the end of his term. And so for most of Mexican history, the Mexicans have been at war with each other, sort of ongoing, constant civil war. And so they looked to a caudillo, a strong man, to come in and somehow establish order in the chaos. The first was, the big one was Santa Anna. And he was a man whose only ideology was sort of self-aggrandizement. And he brought the nation to ruin. He oversaw the loss of Texas and then the loss of what is today the American Southwest, virtually half the country. And so he was a disaster. But the biggest caudillo of all, and it will lead us to the war, was Porfirio Diaz. And he ruled Mexico for 35 years, 1876 to 1911, and a period that is now known as the Porfiriato. And in my book, I do quote myself. I borrow from Charles Dickens, and I say, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was a period of peace and progress. It was a period of oppression and misery. It was an era of immense change. It was an era of stubborn retrenchment. He was a man of immense vision. He was a man of even greater denial. He brought his nation, he was his nation's savior. He was its merciless tyrant. He brought the nation into the modern age, and he brought it into a catastrophic civil war. Porfirio Diaz pursued what he called order and progress, and using a strategy of what he called pan or palo, bread or stick, rewards or punishment. He got everyone in line behind him. So first he would bribe you, co-optation, offer you positions of power if you toed the line. And this is how he took control of pretty much every aspect of the government. He stacked the Senate and the deputies with his people, all the governorships. And so for 35 years you had the semblance of democracy, but it was not a democracy. It was a dictatorship. But one thing he did bring, finally, was 3 decades of peace, which is no small gift to Mexico. And what happened as a result of this peace? Well, massive foreign investment, most of it coming from the United States. And as a result, railroads, telegraphs were built throughout this nation. All of a sudden, things like mining took off. And Mexico, in that respect, did sort of enter the modern age. Mexico City blossomed with theaters and avenues and everything. So Mexico City just became the beautiful jewel that you see in that one sort of area downtown today. That was all built by Diaz. But the trouble is, massive wealth coming in, but it all went into the hands of a very few, very small oligarchy that lived in Mexico City, and everyone else, it was quite the opposite. The rest of the country sort of wallowed in poverty and oppression, with the natives or the indigenous at the bottom. 9 million of them lost their land and became essentially slaves. It was debt peonage, which means sort of you owe your soul to the company store. And so you have this sort of facade or this veneer of modernity and wealth, and behind it is just tremendous, tremendous suffering. Worst, the United States contributed $70 billion, and the United States ended up controlling 90% of Mexican mines, railroads, oil production, and even land. And so, there was a cost for this tremendous wealth, and that was Diaz essentially sold his nation to the United States. And his famous line was, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." And that is still true today. The Mexican economy did skyrocket, but very few people enjoyed the wealth. At the age of 80, he finally announced, "I'm going to step down" in the 1910 elections. And if he had followed through, we would have had a very different history. But in the end, he reneged on his promise and arrested the only really contender, and that's what started the revolution. So after 35 years, he refused to step down, and so the Mexican Revolution started. And I just this came stunning to me when I first began to look at this. I compared the Mexican Revolution to the American Civil War. Now, our Civil War was by far the bloodiest war in U.S. history. As a matter of fact, if you add up all the casualties and dead in all our wars, that means Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, on and on, still doesn't add up to the total number of dead in the U.S. Civil War, which was about 600,000, which works out to be about 0.33% of the U.S. population at the time. So our bloodiest war in our history in the United States, 0.33% of our population. The Mexican Revolution killed somewhere, they believe, as many as 1.5 million people. And that was 10% of its population. So compare that to our bloodiest, 0.33%. In Mexico, it's 10% would perish in these wars. So it's a catastrophic bloodbath. It's actually a series of 3 wars, sort of Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, each of them becoming progressively worse. Act 1 was Francisco Madero, sort of led the revolution against Porfirio Diaz. That was a pretty quick thing, not terribly bloody. He was sent into exile, and Madero became president. If only that had been the end of the story. But as I'll go on, he proved to be a monumental disappointment, which started round 2 in the revolution. Actually, what happened was he was overthrown and assassinated, and then the revolution started again to unseat the man Huerta, who had assassinated him, and that was a far worse Act 2. But they did, they got rid of him, and then all the revolutionaries got together in Aguascalientes, and then they realized to their dismay that the only thing they agreed on was their desire to get rid of Huerta, and they did not trust each other. And that started round 3 of the revolution, which was by far the bloodiest. And in fact, I'll read a quote by U.S. Counsel William Jenkins. He said of this, the third part of the revolution, he said, "It is a cold-blooded traffic in men's lives and nothing more. If the war was for a cause or a reason, if there was any solution in sight, if it was for men's liberty or a heritage for their children, we would, all of us who know Mexico so thoroughly, say that was for the best. But it has degenerated now into a war of pillage and destruction, and the greatest evils which it started out to cure and the reforms it was to establish have been lost." And so to say that tomorrow they will celebrate Revolution Day, they will commemorate it, but it's nothing to celebrate. It was a ruthless bloodbath. Now, the most famous man was Francisco Madero, and he was the man who began the revolution against Porfirio Diaz. And he himself had been a very wealthy landowner, which is ironic because he had the most to lose, but he was very progressive. And when Diaz announced that he was stepping down, Madero wrote a book called The Presidential Succession in 1910. But of course, then Diaz reneged, and he arrested Madero, and that's what started the revolution. And so that's Revolution Day, November 20th, and Madero said, "Throw the usurpers from power, recover your rights as free men, and remember that our ancestors left us a heritage of glory which we are not able to stain. Be as they were, invincible in war, magnanimous in victory." Now, of course, I studied that history. I can wait, where? where did he find it? I don't know where that was, but great words. And so anyways, that was stage 1, and he did win. All the revolutionaries, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, everyone rose up against Diaz and just said enough is enough, and he was sent packing. And if only Madero had proven to be a good president, but he wasn't. He was a sincere idealist, but he was inept and naive. Let's just see, he did free political prisoners, he abolished the death penalty, limited the workday to 10 hours, regulated child labor, and unshackled both the unions and the press. And yet, he appointed primarily Diaz supporters to his cabinet, redistributed barely any land, and while he insisted the revolutionaries put down their arms, he refused to disband the Federal Army. And so all the revolutionaries sort of looked at him and said, "What was it all for? I mean, you aren't doing anything." And when he said, "Well, I'm not Diaz," and they said, "Well, that's not enough." And Pancho Villa met him and he saw his cabinet and he said, "You and these dandies are going to get us all killed." And they did. And Emiliano Zapata immediately restarted the revolution. He said, "This isn't a revolution, it's not over." And so things started to go awry, and because he was inept and naive, Madero turned his security over to Victoriano Huerta, and it was Victoriano Huerta, with the help of U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, who overthrew Madero and assassinated him. And so this is yet another example of the United States sort of overthrowing democratically elected people and installing ruthless dictators, all in the interest of the United States. And Huerta was awful. He was just a drunken thug. And that's really the only thing you could say. And whereas Diaz at least had some finesse and some pizzazz and some charm, he was just a thug. And he said, I'm going to rule with what he called mano dura. And he just stomped on everything. Well, then, of course, the revolution started again to unseat him. So this is now Act 2, and this is to unseat Huerta. And now we're going to hear the other street names. Emiliano Zapata was sort of coming from the south, leading an army mostly of Native Americans, and Pancho Villa with his famed army of the north was coming down, and they were both supposedly under the nominal, I say only nominal, sort of direction of Carranza. And this dragged on for quite a while. So let's talk about these people as they, fight first to unseat Huerta. And then the really ugly part is that when they turned on each other. Emiliano Zapata, he's sort of everyone's favorite because he was, I'd say by far the most sincere and pure. And when he rose up against Madero saying, what kind of revolutionary are you? He can't argue. He came up with what was called the Plan of Ayala, which in many ways is almost a sacred text. It's just a basic document of human and land rights. And he just said that, where it's the land for those who work it. And wherever he was successful, he would sort of distribute the land from the large landowners and among the people. But I would say of all the revolutionaries, the other revolutionaries didn't really respect him or his army. There was tremendous racism involved since he had an army of mostly indigenous people. And so they never really took him as seriously as the other leaders. Carranza, in the end, had him assassinated. And unfortunately, at one time in my book, I just say, to stand up and take part in any of this revolutionary stuff was sort of a combination, an act of homicide and suicide. Because, they'd kill someone else, then someone else would come and kill them. So very few are going to survive. But Emiliano Zapata is one of everyone's favorite, and rightfully so. Now let's go to Pancho Villa. He's everyone's favorite scoundrel. And, pardon? Well, I mean, as to exactly what he was, it's sort of all legendary, and it's kind of hard to track it down. According to legend, a hacienda owner had raped his sister, and so he had murdered him, the hacienda owner, and then he became a bandit, sort of a Robin Hood who stole from the rich, gave to the poor, and according to legend, he married 75 women. Now, what's there not to like in that? And, but he ended up becoming a commander of the famed Division of the North. And it did become quite famous. Apparently, he forbade his troops to engage in any drinking or looting, and wherever he conquered, he distributed land and built schools. And he was so successful that his tactics were studied in the US military academies, and the Hollywood decided to make a documentary film about him. So, he'd wait to begin the battle, and are all the cameras in place? Okay, ready? Action! And then you can't make this stuff up. And the people from Hollywood he said, these peasants, it's just not dramatic enough. So the movies bought the uniforms for all of his soldiers so they would look more soldierly. It would just look so much better in the movie. So he was the darling of everyone for quite a while. And he did say, my sole ambition is to rid Mexico of that class that has oppressed her and give the people a chance to know what real liberty means. But Carranza, however, eventually they unseat Huerta, and then of course they all meet at Aguas Calientes, and the only thing they can agree on is they hate each other. And then they go to battle against each other, and this is when things really degenerated into madness, and it was just a mess. But Carranza had the best general, Obregón, and he had studied both the US Civil War and World War I, and he realized it's trench warfare. And he used trench warfare and brought Villa down. And so Carranza ends up defeating most, the famed Division of the North, breaks its back against Obregón's trenches, Zapata is gone, and so Carranza emerges as sort of the last man standing. Now, what happens to Villa? Eventually, Carranza is assassinated by Obregón, and then Obregón goes to Villa and said, well, you wanted to get rid of Carranza, so why don't you just stop fighting? And which is what Villa eventually did. And so now the question is, did he sell out? Did he just face facts? You know, what had he won? It's not really clear, but he went into retirement. But this one historian, I'll quote him, he had this gigantic hacienda outside Durango. And the historian said, Villa organized communal work, turned the church into a barn, brought agricultural machinery, planted wheat, corn, and beans, founded an agricultural credit bank, installed carpentry and shoe shops. He built a school for the children and houses for the workers. He just created sort of this little nirvana of what he hoped would be true for all of Mexico. But then he started saying, maybe I should run for president. And no, and so then they assassinated him. So Carranza is the last man standing. And he did, I mean, he's very controversial, but he gave Mexico 3 amazing gifts. The first was peace. He finally, you know, for better or worse, he stopped the Civil War. Secondly, he took on the United States, because the United States was World War I, needed the oil. Mexico has oil. It looked like the United States was going to invade again and take the oil fields, and using the Monroe Doctrine or whatever. And Carranza came up with his own Carranza Doctrine. And let's see if I think I had that. I don't have it done it. But he pretty said Mexico will be for Mexicans, sorry. And he said if a single troop crosses the border, I will set fire to those oil fields and burn them to the ground. And so he kept the United States out. But the third thing he did, and it was sort of serendipitous or whatever, he said, I need to legitimize my government, especially in the eyes of the United States. So let's get a new constitution. And he just called the Constitutional Convention and he said, do some tweaks. You know, just give me a paper that I can hold up and say, see, I'm legitimate. Well, to his horror, they came up with the Constitution of 1917, which remains one of the most progressive documents on the planet even today. And I mean, he was sort of, what? And so he just sort of, you know, said, okay, and then he ignored it. But let's look at what it did. I mean, first, and this is why February 5th is Constitution Day, and it should be celebrated. Sweeping land reform, transforming huge haciendas into communal ejidos, which is communally held indigenous land, which is why whenever we go hiking in the hills up here, it's all ejido land. This is straight from the Constitution, why they still own this land today. It pretty much gave free land to anyone willing to put it in production. It also, they were sick and tired of the United States invading along the coast, so they said no foreigners may own any land along the coast. That came straight out of the invasion at Veracruz. They were sick and tired of the Americans taking their land. So if you wonder why you have to, you know, purchase long-term leases instead of owning land, it comes out of this Constitution. It also really enshrined worker rights, and this is where it went way beyond the U.S. Constitution. It protected unions and their right to strike, calling for an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, equal pay for women, safe working conditions, compensation for workplace injury, a ban on company stores, which means an end of debt peonage, and the abolition of child labor and even Sundays off. This is in their Constitution. I mean, our unions were fighting for this long after Mexico already had it in their Constitution. Some of the most controversial parts of the Constitution targeted the Catholic Church because the liberals were really sick of the church owning and running everything. And they pretty much said free, mandatory, secular education. They wanted to take education out of the hands of the church and put it in the hands of secular institutions, and required that the churches start to pay taxes, nationalize their properties, and so on. I mean, it was just a really damning document to the Catholic Church. And the last part was, its boldest provision was that all the land, everything beneath the soil, belonged to the Mexican people. And that is going to have, when President Cárdenas takes over, that's what he uses to nationalize all the U.S. oil interests. And so Carranza pretty much, and most of the presidents just ignored the Constitution. One of them, Calles, did go after the church. And he said, I'm going to enforce that, but that led to the Cristero War, where once again Mexicans were killing each other. Mexicans take their religion, either for or against, very seriously, and so they had to back off from that. But Cárdenas took the land reform. After Benito Juárez, Lázaro Cárdenas was probably the most beloved president. In 1934, he comes in and says, I'm actually going to implement these reforms, and distributes massive amounts of land. And then nationalizes. He said, Mexico is for Mexico, sorry United States, we're taking it back. And why he was not assassinated in some, we did it in Guatemala, El Salvador, everywhere else. He was just too damn popular. I think that was the reason that he survived. But he's the one who really did his best to implement the Constitution of 1917. But he and the others did institutionalize something else, and that was what came to be known as the PRI, the Revolutionary Party. And it was the new caudillo. The Mexicans just realized we're never going to get it together. We need someone in charge to run things, and that became the PRI. And whoever was anointed president, and it was an anointing, every outgoing president in a ceremony called the dedazo, the finger pointing, would say, this is my successor. And then that person would emerge as the next caudillo, and for the next 50 years, once again, the semblance of real democracy. And that's the way things remained for most of Mexican history. And then in 1992, one of the most controversial presidents, Salinas de Gortari, he had become an economist at the Harvard School of Law, took all of the United States neoliberal reforms and brought them into Mexico, and sort of rewrote or unwrote the Constitution and got rid of most of the reforms that had been there. And so in the end, under his, and that was in 1992, they sort of turned their back on the revolution and turned their back on their own Constitution. And that's where we are today, essentially. The PRI is out, and so Mexico is really in transition, trying to figure out, well, where, whither now. And AMLO is there, and it appears to be a democratic election, but not for how long that's going to last. But the other problem is that, in the last election, there